So here we have the old city of Jerusalem, and I'll start off. Remember, we left Jesus last in the Gospel of John in Ephraim, and he had gone off there to hide out after the raising of Lazarus. Turns out that freaked some people out, and a lot of people had turned their hearts to Jesus, and because of what he had done with Lazarus. And so Jesus took off and he went down to a place called Ephraim, which is sort of down near the Jordan. Some of you have been there with me. Who's been there with me, right? And so it's in a predominantly Christian area still. So he went down there for about 40 days, and then he came back. And he came back first to Bethany, and this is the Bethany that's just on the other side of the hill from Jerusalem, but pretty close, a couple of miles at most, probably a little less than that. And that is where Mary and Martha and Lazarus had a home. It's also where Simon the leper had a home. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they talked about going to Simon the leper's home for a meal. In the Gospel of John, they talked about going to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' home for a meal. I think, the way I like thinking about that story, and this is for a completely different class, but I wonder if Mary, Martha, and Lazarus aren't the children of Simon the leper. Maybe. Nonetheless, there they are, and we find them in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14. And let me read these words, because this lays out the confusion that we sit upon. Right? How many Jesuses are there? One, right? One cross, right? One Holy Week, right? And yet, in the Gospel of John, it reads, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to the home of Lazarus, and there was a feast. It says down here in Mark, it was 2 days before the Passover. The chief priests were looking for Jesus while in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. And so what we have here is a question, when the heck was Passover? What's going on? Why can't these guys straighten it out? Why can't they get their calendars right? This Bible needs a good editor. And it did not have one. Because any of you would have picked that up, and right? So anyway, it's important to remember, and I have these, if you guys want one of these, I'll show you this. I'm going to hand this out. It doesn't look good, that's why I'm handing it out. I'm not going to talk about this. But this is a very sophisticated drawing that's wonderful to study, and I commend it to you, about the two different calendars that were, do you want to hand these out? Do you mind, Susan, handing those out? Whoever wants one. You don't have to take one. There's two different calendars that are in existence at the time of Jesus. There is the calendar of the temple. And the calendar of the temple is followed by the high priests, the scribes, the Pharisees. It's followed by the disciples of Jesus. It's followed by Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And the way that calendar is interpreted is at the beginning of each month, after two witnesses determine together the sighting of the new moon, the moment that happens, there were two people in the temple. Once they sighted the moon, they verified it, they told the high priest, and at that point, all of the festivals for that month were set. So they were working on a lunar calendar, and they didn't know the day of the festival until the month in which it existed, based on the sighting of the new moon. Now that is imagine the planning. Right? Look, I can't plan my vacation yet because I don't know when Passover is. Back then, it didn't seem to be as big a problem. So all Jewish celebrations were 1 month out based on two people's proclamation. So in the gospel, against the lunar calendar, we'll get to this, that's what John follows. The Last Supper in the Gospel of John is what? What do they do in the Gospel of John for their last meal together? They wash feet. They don't celebrate the Passover. You're wondering why? That's why. Right? That's why it's represented not as a Passover meal, but as a foot washing. Now in the Synoptics, they're a solar calendar, and the Essenes and Jesus' mother who was Mary, and his brothers followed the Essene calendar. And that went on a 365-day-a-year cycle. And so they knew when Passover was. It was the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which is April. That was Passover. And so in the Synoptic Gospels, when we get to the Passover meal, it's a meal, isn't it? It's interesting. You have these two things happening simultaneously. So that's why. So as we ride through this last week of Jesus' life, we have two stories that tie together, but they have a slight difference because they're working off two different calendars or two different ways in which that week is marked. Now, here's what I love so much about that. That the people that put this gospel together thought that was okay. They thought it was okay that you could have these two separate plot lines based on two different calendars followed by two different Jewish communities. And they believed, because they had faith, that God was going to be able to manage that. That God had the capacity to work with the idiosyncratic nature of cultures and people and divisions. Because we could get all the way to the cross and we can get all the way to the resurrection with two different things working simultaneously, because in both of them they are included in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's the lesson. Right? That's the lesson. So anyway, we're going to walk through that. You see, this is why we're not talking about that. Among other reasons. So let's talk. So Jesus, I have Palm Sunday up here? So back to Palm Sunday. So here comes Jesus, right? He comes in here, goes to Bethany, has a big meal. Then he comes into the Golden Gate right there. A lot of you have been there with me. And he goes to the Temple Mount. And simultaneously, this guy over here, this is exactly what Pontius Pilate looked like. He's coming down. Now, Pontius Pilate's irritated. He's got a castle up on Caesarea Maritus, right on the water. It's a sweet place. He's up there hanging out. It's where he likes to be, on the ocean. And now he's got to come down to Jerusalem because things are so funky with the Jewish communities there, and you never know what's going to happen on Passover. And so he comes in with all of his guys on his war horse, and you got Jesus on a little donkey coming in this way. Two kings ready to clash, right? So this is the beginning of Palm Sunday. It's what we celebrate. We move through these. Now, on Monday and Tuesday of Holy Week, Jesus comes in. Palm Sunday, he went home. He was staying in Bethany with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Let me get to my notes. He comes home during the evening, comes back during the day. And he comes back in the Gospel of Luke. When he first comes in after Palm Sunday on Monday, he comes down. So you may remember that Bethany, so there's a lot of hills. Jerusalem is up on a bunch of hills. And over the hill going west is Bethany. And so Jesus comes up from Bethany, and he comes up on a hill. And that hill is called what? It's the Mount of Olives, right? We've taken that walk. Now, if you haven't taken that walk with me in the Holy Land, we're going again in February 2025. If you want to go with me, do come, because we'll go to all these places, and then you'll have walked in these places. So anyway, he comes down, and as he comes down over the hill, he stops. And in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us he weeps for Jerusalem. And today, in the place where he stopped and wept, there's a church. It's called the Teardrop Church. And it's literally in the shape of a tear. It's very small. It's a beautiful chapel. And we go in there and pray when we do this walk. And so he comes over and he comes down. He's really coming this way. Comes right in here and he goes back into the temple. And what he does in the temple for Monday and Tuesday is that he teaches. Right? Some of his great teachings happen while he's there. He talks about the widow's mite. He talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. He talks about paying taxes to Rome. He tells the parable of the wicked tenants. Right? And there's a lot going on in the Synoptic Gospels when Jesus is there in the temple. Every day. And the chief priests, it says in the Gospel of Luke, right here, the chief priests are kept looking for ways to kill him, but they could not find any because the people were spellbound by what he was saying. And so they didn't know what to do, right? They didn't know how to get their hands on him. So anyway, those are the things. Finally, he says something that ticks him off. I do not judge anyone who hears. Oh, I love this line. I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them. For I came not to judge the world, but to save it. I speak as my Father told me. Right? We find that. So that's Jesus. Jesus did not come to judge. He came to save. And he came to save by revealing how we are connected to God by the love of God. That's what we preach and teach here. Right? So if you got some judgy Jesus going on over here, it's probably not the Jesus that you would quote from the Bible. Right? So when you hear judgy folks, I wonder, are you talking to me about Jesus from John 12? Maybe they are. Maybe they're not. So anyway, they're looking for ways to kill Jesus. And the thing to note now is Tuesday evening is what day of the week on the Jewish calendar? It's Wednesday. The minute the sun goes down, the new day starts. So when you start counting and you wonder how Jesus gets 3 days from Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, it has to do when you start counting the days. Right? So the day begins when the sun goes down. So Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday, according to the solar calendar, the Essenes, Passover is on Wednesday. So Jesus says to a couple of his disciples, go and prepare the Passover feast for me. So he sends, who does he send? John and Peter to go do this. And the story is really interesting. Do you remember what happens? He says, look, go down to this place, the shepherd's pool, and you're going to see a monk. And the monk, the guy is going to be carrying water. And so I want you to follow the monk up to the monastery and go into the monastery and say to the abbot, the Lord needs a space. Remember that story? It's in the Bible, Gospel of Luke. It's a great story. And so, Gospel of Luke, chapter 22. So anyway, a monk looks something like this. So the interesting thing is, so we know when we read this story in the Gospel of Luke, that this is about the solar calendar, right? Getting Passover ready before Passover begins. When does Passover begin? If it's on Wednesday, the 15th day of Nisan. It begins Tuesday night, right? So the Passover meal starts Tuesday night when the sun goes down. So they got to get this thing set up on Tuesday afternoon before the sun goes down. So they go over, and now how do we know it's an Essene community that they're going into, other than it says Essene Quarter right down here, and Essene Guest House, and Essene Monastery. Other than that, we know because we have a man carrying water. Oh, says Linda. Oh, a man carrying water, right, tells us it's an Essene community because the Essenes were radically inclusive, right? You'd never find within the Pharisee community or the Sadducee community a woman carrying water. No way is that going to happen, right? So we know, because it's a man carrying the water, right, up to the monastery, that this is an Essene community. And Jesus, who had been living with the Pharisees and living with disciples and Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who had followed the lunar calendar of the traditional temple community, he reverts back to the old temple, the old Passover, the old lunar calendar of his youth, the calendar of Mary, the calendar of the Essenes, the calendar that they followed in Nazareth. And he does this so he can celebrate the Passover, right, with his disciples, because he won't be able to celebrate it on Saturday because, well, he'll be dead, would be the short answer. So he celebrates it with his disciples, and it's believed that his brother James, is what he looked like, who was the first bishop of Jerusalem, his older brother James. I love that. Virgin mother, older brother. You guys have heard me talk about that too. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Why Mary's a virgin. She has the 4 older kids. If you don't know that story, come back. When do I talk about that, Jed? Christmas? I usually talk about that when we talk about Mary at Christmas. So stay tuned. So anyway, his brother was an Essene, so he was probably well known by this community. And when they said, my Lord needs to use this room, they know immediately who that is. They know it is Jesus. So those guys go up there to get this room, the Essene guest house, ready for Jesus. And then the sun goes down. Oh, the other thing I want to mention, though, back here. In the Gospel of John, right, which is running on the lunar calendar, it also acknowledges that Jesus is over here. But what they say is now the Passover was near, and many went up from the countryside to purify themselves. In preparation for the Passover, they would come to this pool here, the serpent's pool, or this pool up here. These were 2 Essene areas. This is where Mary lived outside the temple near the sheep's pool. And this was Essene quarter down here near the serpent's pool. Why would Essenes always live near pools? Well, they wash themselves. That was part of their thing was daily baths. And so when you go to the Holy Land, places that have a lot of pools probably were Essene communities. So anyway, so they're in the Essene guest house, and we have 2 different things happening at the same time. It's Tuesday evening after the sun is set, and in the Synoptic Gospels, we have, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And so this is when Jesus sanctifies or codifies within the imagination of the disciples the idea of the bread and the blood, right? The bread and the wine being his body and blood. Now that's such a tricky idea. Sometimes people get completely sort of sideways about that we're the people of cannibalism, right? We're the people that eat bodies and drink blood, and it sounds sort of out there. But what we know as Christians is A, we're made in the image and likeness of God. B, that Jesus calls us to be like him, to be present in the world, like he was present in the world, and to have vitality as he had vitality, to have that Christian charism that changes the world, both makes us better and it makes our presence in the world better. And so the body is, have you ever heard it called the presence? Right? It is the presence of Jesus, and so we eat that so to be present with Christ here. Right? That's what that symbolizes. And the blood in the Jewish tradition was the vitality of an animal. That's why Jews never ate the blood. That's why they have kosher meat, right? They have to drain all the blood out in a certain way before they can eat it, because they didn't want to take on the vitality of the animal. So, when we drink the wine, that is taking on the vitality, the charism. So being Jesus in the world and acting like Jesus in the world is the symbolism that we get from the body and the blood. Do this in remembrance of me. Think about me in your life when you do this. Now, on the other side of this, we have Jesus washing the feet, right? And what's he showing us there? Well, humility for sure. Servitude, yes. Right? Do as I do. So over on one side of this the gospel, we have be Jesus in the world, be like Jesus in the world, and this is how you should be like Jesus in the world over here on the other side. Do you see how that fits together? That is completely lovely. So you have sort of the metaphysical reality, the body and the blood, and then you have this is what you do. You serve people, serve one another, right? You have no part in me. Remember, Jesus says this to Peter. You have no part in me if you don't do what I do. So you have these same meal, 2 representations, same time. One, this one over here on the lunar calendar. This one over here. Oh, sorry. This one over here on the lunar calendar. This one over here on the solar calendar. And it takes place right there. Tracking with me? 2 things, different things, same thing happening. I love this. So now, see how I use green? So now we have Judas. Look at how shifty he looks. Super shifty guy. Should have known early on what a bad dude he was. But so Judas Iscariot. You know what that means? Man from Cariot. He was the one disciple who wasn't from Galilee. He wasn't from north. He was from the south. It's okay. And he was a zealot. And some people think about his betraying Jesus not necessarily because he wanted to have Jesus killed, but it was a forcing function, right? So what did they need? They needed Jesus to be the Messiah. And what's the Messiah going to do? He's going to overthrow Rome, right? And Judas has been with him for 3 years. And what he has seen in this guy, Jesus, is a guy who has the capacity to overthrow Rome, right? I mean, he's got it, right? People follow him. You know, 2 loaves and 5 fish, he can feed an army, right? I mean, this guy can do everything that's needed to be done to overthrow Rome and set Jerusalem as the center of the world as it should be. And so Judas then goes out there and he thinks that if he forces Jesus into a confrontation with Pilate and his men, Jesus is going to push back, right? And the rebellion's going to start. How great is that? It's one theory. So he slips out, shifty Judas, and he goes over to Caiaphas' house, and he says, got Jesus, know where he is, know what he's doing, know where he's going. And Caiaphas says, where? And he says, well, after dinner, we're having dinner over here, then he's going to go back up to the Mount of Olives and to Gethsemane, and you can meet him there. How will we know who he is? He's the guy with the beard and the long hair. Says, I'll give him a kiss. So there's Judas over there, floating around. And now Jesus and his buddies, Judas is taken off. They walk out here. I don't know where they go. They probably walk out here. They go outside. They walk up the Kidron Valley. They go back up to the Mount of Olives. They go up into Gethsemane, and they sit down for a bit. Big dinner, a lot of walking, getting cramps. Everybody's tired. The disciples sit down, and Jesus goes over and prays. Remember what happens? He says, what's he saying?
Take this cup from me.
Yeah, take this cup from me. He's praying, blood's coming out of his head. I mean, like, this is hardcore, this intense prayer. And he asks his disciples to stay awake, and the disciples can't stay awake. Man, these guys. So they can't stay awake. Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come to the time of trial. Turns out every single one of them come to the time of trial. So they're up here, and then Judas comes up, and they come up with lanterns. So, non sequitur, but when you're looking at the reredos up in the front of the church, right? And you look up, and you can see all the shields there, right? And all the flowers. And then if you look up carved, there's some beautiful carvings up there. And I've done a whole study, classes on that. Y'all know what I'm going to say. But one of the carvings up there is this lantern, right there. And the lantern represents what? The guys coming up, right? With all the soldiers, they come up to Jesus, and Judas gives him a kiss. But do you guys remember this? There's just a great scene in the garden where they come up to Jesus to give him a kiss. The soldiers appear, and they have their swords drawn, and Jesus steps forward. This is Gospel of John, chapter 18. Jesus steps forward, and do you know what happens to all the soldiers? They fall to the ground. Chapter 18, Gospel of John. And they ask where Jesus is, and he steps forward, and they fall to the ground. And then they get up, and that's where Jesus steps forward, fall to the ground. And then one of the high priest's secretaries, a guy named Malchus, what happens to Malchus? Peter pulls out his sword, whacks off his ear. Whacks it off. And Jesus says to Peter, put away your sword. And then tradition says Jesus picks up the ear and he puts it back on. And they still arrest him, right, Karen? You're like, the dude who puts an ear back on is somebody thou shalt not arrest. It turns out that wasn't in their book. So oops, where are we? Oh, we got way back. Let's see what happened here. Where are we? That's where we are. Let's go to slideshow. So, sorry about that. So here we are. So he goes falling back. Now, so then Jesus used, why'd you come to me with spears and clubs? You could have arrested me on Monday. You could have arrested me on Tuesday. You didn't. Now you come out in the middle of the night to arrest me, right? But it's true. Most evil, most things we want to hide, most things we are ashamed of happen when? They happen at night, baby. In that nothing great happens after midnight, usually. Not exclusively, but usually. So anyway, so they grab Jesus. He goes with them. The disciples take off. One dude follows behind. Do you remember this? One of my favorite scenes in the Bible. One guy follows behind and he's creeping him out. He's a guy who's wearing only a linen shroud. Remember this guy? He's wearing a linen shroud. It's the Gospel of Mark. It's the only place. Gospel of Mark, I can't remember which chapter 14, verse 51. And the soldiers freak out, so they go over and they rip off his shroud, and he runs away naked. That's it. Just a weird little sentence right up there. He's the only guy that sticks around. He's the guy in the death shroud, and they rip it off, and he runs away naked. So there are streakers in the Bible. And Elizabeth, who would I say that is? Lazarus, for sure. Because as John Kerry will tell you, if you don't know what the answer is and you're in one of my classes, it's probably Lazarus. So that's what happens. I don't have any pictures of the streaker up here today. But they take Jesus then, and they go down here, and they're going to go to Caiaphas' house, the Bible tells us. But Caiaphas isn't ready. He had no idea that they were going to be able to pick him up that quick. They thought there'd be a fight, and they have to go up and get in a big fight. It was going to take a long time. He's going to be tired. Turns out Jesus just goes with them. And so instead of going to Caiaphas' house, they shoot up the street to Ananias' house, who was had been the high priest before Caiaphas, his father-in-law. It says first, Gospel of John tells us, they took him to Annas' house, who was the high father-in-law, a lot of spelling errors here, of Caiaphas. And he stayed up there. And that's where Peter shows up behind him. It's still Wednesday night. Lots happening. Or Wednesday early in the morning, right? Tuesday night, we would call it Tuesday night. And that's where Peter shows up. And the girl says, aren't you one of those guys from Galilee? And he says, what? No, I'm not. No, not me. No, not me. And then what happens? The cock crows. And Peter feels pretty bad about that. So anyway, they bring him then from down to Caiaphas' house here. And this is where the Sanhedrin meets. And the Sanhedrin are the 71 Jewish leaders who make decisions, right? And they all come and they gather there to meet Jesus in the morning. So now it's Wednesday morning. It's halfway through Wednesday according to the Jewish calendars. And they have all sorts of people come forward to make witness about Jesus. And they're liars. All of them are liars. Over and over again, they're liars. And finally, Caiaphas, in his frustration, just asks him straight up, are you the Son of God? To which Jesus answers, he pulls a Bible quote. You'll see the Son of Man at the right hand of God coming in the clouds. He quotes Psalm 110 and Daniel. And this is enough. Jesus is a big Bible quoter, especially this last week. We'll find that out more, even to the point when he arrives on the cross. And that's enough to make Caiaphas crazy, rips his coat, says this guy has blasphemed against God, and blasphemy requires death. Death. Now here's a problem with signing someone to death, is that they can't carry it out because only Rome can carry it out. So they think he's guilty and he needs to be put to death, but they can't carry that out. So they have to take him to Pilate to do it, but they don't take him right away. Why? Karen, what? It's on the board, right? Fortunately, they had an excellent PowerPoint at the time, and one of the guys was like, excuse me. So you have to remember, there were some secret disciples of Jesus on the Sanhedrin. We know two of them by name. Nicodemus was one of them, right? We see him 3 times in the Gospel of John, and the other one was Joseph of Arimathea, right? Those 2 guys are on there. So one of them, maybe both of them, probably said, wait, hey, look it. We can't, we need to abide by the law. These are law-abiding guys, right? So you cannot, the Mishnah guideline for jurisprudence says, you cannot declare a man worthy of death who helped people, Jesus, while he lived without a 24-hour reprieve. So now we have to wait 24 hours. So now we jump forward, and that time passes. So now we're Thursday morning. They waited through Wednesday, Thursday night, Thursday morning. They take him up to Anatolia's castle up here. And this is where Herod stayed when he was in town. And Herod meets him and asks him all sorts of questions. And in Antonio's fortress, that's what this is, to see, is this guy guilty? And and they get into that conversation. What's the very famous Pilate line? What is truth? Right? That happens in this conversation. And he finds out in this conversation with Jesus that he's from Galilee. And so he says to himself, oh, you're from Galilee. You're not my problem. You're Herod's problem. Right? So then Pilate sends him over to Herod's palace, which is over here. And Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, who happens to also be in Jerusalem for the Passover feast. And this is where Herod's like, finally, right? Finally, he gets to meet Jesus. Because he's been looking to meet Jesus for a long time. And he finally meets Jesus and is in conversation with him. And doesn't really know what to do with him. So he sends him. I always think, every time I think of this scene, I think of Jesus Christ Superstar. Remember that? When he asked him to walk on water? I might have asked that too. Right? But he doesn't. So he sends him back to Antony's fortress to see Pilate. But, and this is what I love, right? This is the power of Jesus Christ. So Herod Antipas and Pilate were enemies. They did not like each other at all, right? It was overlapping power struggles, right? You had Pontius Pilate there because of Rome. You have Herod there out of, inherited this, and they didn't like each other. But it says in the Gospel of Luke, on that same day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Well, a compliment. I don't know. I mean, they weren't great guys independently. But, they probably didn't have many friends. But Jesus can do that. See, that's the power of the Trinitarian God. Right? The power of the Trinitarian God is to call out the reality that any people can be in relationship with one another. We got it right there. So Herod sends him back up to Pontius Pilate. And that's when Pilate says, hey, do you want to release this guy or do you want to release Barabbas? And they say, what? Barabbas. And so they release Barabbas. Pilate has Jesus whipped and flogged 39 times. And that's when they play the King's Game, where they put the purple robe on him and the crown of thorns. That is in the basement of Antonia's fortress. And when we walk the Stations of the Cross, because we do that, we carry the cross and we walk through the streets of Jerusalem. And it sounds weird, but those of you who have done it know how incredibly powerful it is. Right, Kelly? I mean, it's unbelievable. So we start there, right? Because we come in, we go over here, we start right there, and walk all the way to Golgotha with the cross. So that's where Jesus starts off. Thursday afternoon, the Passover is on Saturday, and Jesus spends the night in the dungeon in Antonio's fortress. Next day, so that night, so Pilate's staying in Antonio's fortress. The next morning, his wife shows up. And his wife had a dream. And in the dream, the dream came and said, have nothing to do with Jesus. Like, stay away from this dude. This, if you're the one that's sentenced to death, people are going to be talking about it for a long time. So, yeah. It turns out they are still doing it. His wife was right. Like if you ever saying something to your husband, say, "Oh, you listen." Guess who else didn't listen? Pilate. So she comes and says that. So then Pilate goes out in front of everybody and says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. You take care of him." Right? She says, this is Matthew 27, "Have nothing to do with this innocent man. I've suffered terribly in a dream because of him." So that's when Pilate does the hand washing thing. I don't want anything to do with this guy. And he says, "You take care of him." So they send him then to death on the cross. It's very interesting right here, right as you leave the city to go outside, there's the tradition is that you wait there. And anybody who was going to Golgotha, who was sentenced to death, you would wait there for a couple of minutes, maybe more than that, because that's the very last moment for reprieve. So they waited there. Nothing happened, and Jesus went out. But along the way, he met a man named Simon of Cyrene. And he was a man from Africa who wandered along, who Jesus couldn't carry the cross, and he carried the cross for Jesus. That is a big thing. That's powerful. And they carry it out there, and they hang Jesus on the cross. Now the cross, this was in no way a unique event at all, right? The cross was a great invention of the Romans. During the Spartacus slave rebellion, they crucified 6,000 people. They had a cross on the road between Rome and Caputa every 40 yards for 130 miles. With the person hanging on the cross. And the way they would do is they'd tie him on a cross beam, and then they would lift the cross beam up, and then they would drop it on a post with a little indent, and just drop into that, and they would hang him up there. So during the Galilean rebellion before Jesus, when the Rome was fighting the Maccabees, they crucified 2,000 people. Right, so this was a visual memory that was sort of grafted into their minds. It is a horror show. Because how do people die when they die on the cross? Strangulation, suffocation, right? Because their lungs collapse. So not only is it incredibly painful, but they sort of die of suffocation. So this was something that was seen. In fact, it says during the time when they destroyed the temple, 70 years after Jesus' death, there were so many crucifixions that they ran out of wood, right, to crucify folks. So they take Jesus about a half a kilometer walk out to Golgotha. And we hear about the women who are weeping along the way. There is corporate PTSD from crucifixion, right? So it's probably an automatic response for people to weep. And right in here, Jesus walks by a woman named Veronica, remember? She wipes his face, and that creates the Shroud of Turin. So anyway, that happens, and they come out onto this park. Golgotha was an old quarry where that was in disrepair, and so Jesus is out here now. This is Friday, and the next day is the Sabbath. So there's a lot of people walking by. Lots of people walking by as they're coming in with their cattle and their livestock to be sacrificed at the temple. So anyway, it's 9 o'clock in the morning by the time he arrives, and they put him up on the cross. And Jesus cries out from the cross. Do you remember his words? My God, why have you forsaken me? And what do you think when you hear that? God let him down? God took off? It's Jürgen Moltmann's theory. But I might suggest something else. So you have to remember that these folks that were followers of Jesus, they knew one book really well. What was that? It was the Bible. Just the Old Testament part. And they knew the Bible really well. And this line, my God, why have you forsaken me, comes from where? Psalm 22. Right. And so Jesus, he's hanging up there. His lungs are collapsing. It says he cries out with a loud voice, which is almost impossible, right? With his lungs collapsing, right? Jesus is an extraordinary guy. He is an extraordinary, like just on the face of it, the guy's extraordinary. So he calls out, and his disciples are cowering. There's only two people at the foot of the cross, right? Mother Mary and, depends on who you ask. The beloved disciple for sure. We'll call him the beloved disciple. We'll stick with that for now. But the other guys they've taken off. And so he cries out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? And they know what comes next, because they know Psalm 22. And they know that if you know that by heart, and you say it in your mind, and you get to the very end of it, you will find redemption. It's a psalm that goes from the bad to the good, where the bad thing isn't the last thing. That's Psalm 22. I just summarized it for you so you don't have to read it. And so he's saying to them, wait. Don't freak out. Don't lose hope. Right? We got a better plan than the plan that's going to kill a dude on the cross. God is better than that. So he's giving them a signal. Right? And then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 hours hanging there, which is pretty quick, he is dead. And the curtain rips from top to bottom. Right? Now, why does the curtain rip from top to bottom?
Access to the temple.
All of a sudden, insight into the Holy of Holies, right? The Holy of Holies is revealed to all people. And it rips from the top to the bottom. It's like 40 feet high because God does it. Right? That's not people at the bottom ripping it up. It's God ripping it down. And you can see into the nature of God. Everybody's included because of the person of Jesus Christ. And it gets pretty dark, and it gets pretty ugly out. It's a bad day, and it's storming, and there's a centurion, and he says, surely this is the Son of God, right? So Jesus dies, and then because it's the day before the Passover, nobody wants dead people hanging up during the Passover, so the soldiers go through and they break the legs of all the other people, right? Why did they break the legs? How does it kill them? They can't hold themselves up anymore. That's right. And so their lungs collapse faster. But they go to Jesus. He's already dead. They want to make sure. Boom, they stick a spear in. And yup, he's dead. So Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate, probably had before, and said, hey, I want to pull him down, and I want to put him in my tomb. And Pilate, at this point, doesn't want anything to do with this guy. And if Joseph of Arimathea says that, and he's part of the Sanhedrin, he says, okay. He and Nicodemus, they go, and they take him, and they lay him in his tomb. And then the sun sets and Passover has begun. And they seal the tomb. They don't seal it a little bit, do they? No. They seal it a lot. Why do they seal it a lot? Because they don't want somebody to come in and steal the body and say, hey, the dude was resurrected. Yeah. They don't want that because that wouldn't look great for them. So they seal it up and they put a bunch of burly guys, Roman centurions, and these guys don't get shook by very much. I mean, these are like sort of the Navy SEALs of the Delta Force of the Roman centurion guard. They're there and they close it up and they stand there with it to guard it so nothing happens. And so now we got Friday, Saturday. Friday's one day, Saturday's next day, and then Saturday night takes us to Sunday, which is the third day, and Sunday morning, the Passover has passed up, and they go to bury the body as it should be buried. And let's see, and who goes there first? We got two stories going on. We have the Synoptic Gospels, and we have the Gospel of John. And in the Synoptic Gospels, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary go to the tomb, and they meet a guy who is on fire inside. It's an angel, and in one of the rememberings in the Synoptic Gospels, there's one angel. In one, there's two angels, and these women are pretty surprised by that. And who wouldn't it be? And they say, go to Galilee to meet Jesus, just like he said. Now, on the John side of it, we have Mary Magdalene going all by herself. And she goes and she sees the stone is rolled over, so she runs back to tell the disciples. And who goes running? Poof, like a shot. Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. And who's faster? The disciple whom Jesus loved. And he gets there first, and he looks in, and he sees the cloth all rolled up, and he believes. And Peter comes in, and he believes, and they know something's happened, that Jesus is alive in the world. They take off. Mary finally catches up with them, not quite as quick, and she meets Jesus in the garden. So these are the resurrection encounters. The stories are a little bit different. You'll notice that the disciple whom Jesus loved and Lazarus never show up in the Synoptic Gospels at all. Not at all, unless maybe you're counting the streaker in the Gospel of Mark. That's the only time. Incidentally, if you're wondering about Lazarus, because I talk about him all the time, I'm going to talk a little bit more about him next Sunday before the Feast of St. Lazarus. So we're meeting here at 9 o'clock. Saturday, we're meeting here at 9 o'clock on Saturday. We'll talk a little bit about Lazarus, then we'll have a very beautiful worship service for that. So now, this coming Saturday, right, 9 o'clock. 8:30 for breakfast. 8:30 for breakfast, sorry. 9 o'clock, I'll start talking. 8:30 for breakfast. So now we see the resurrected Jesus show up. We see him in the Gospel of Mark sitting at the table with the 11. We see him in the Gospel of Luke on the road to Emmaus. We see him in the Gospel of John. He meets with the disciples, except one wasn't there. Who's that guy? Thomas. He got a second job. He couldn't make that meal. But then he meets Jesus, and he says, "My Lord and my God." So we have sightings of Jesus here in Jerusalem. We also have sightings of him up on a mountain in Galilee. And this is so great. The disciples went to the mountain where Jesus directed them. They saw him and worshiped him. And I love this line so much. It's such an important line. But some doubted that that was Jesus. So why is that so important? It's super important for our theology. Even the resurrected God gives you a choice to reject him. Jesus there resurrected in the presence of people, and God still gave them the choice to not believe in him. Because God loves us that much. Again, the genius of the resurrection is God with rejecting human rejection and still honoring our freedom. That's what the resurrection is. Humanity kills God. God lets it happen. And yet God says, I reject your rejection, but I won't force you to believe in me. And that's what we get here. That line tells it all. It's an important line in understanding the resurrection. If Jesus came back and everybody had to believe in Jesus because of his sheer presence, all of a sudden love would be swept out of the world. And everyone would just be afraid of the big guy floating in the sky. And God loves us more than that. So anyway, that happens there. And then, of course, he is on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, and they can't catch any fish. He says, throw it over to the other side. They catch how many fish? 153. Why 153? Because that's the number, Karen. 153. Why? I mean, that's why 100, because there was 153 fish. So they catch 153 fish. And they bring it in, they count it, and they remember it. 153, weird number. And Jesus, that's also when he commissions Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved to go out into the world. So this brings us to the end of Jesus' travels. Any questions? Thoughts? No questions at all? We'll do it again in a couple of years.